Good evening, everyone. This is the place, and I'm not exactly that guy with the shaggy hair and the white beard. I'm Diana Clarion, welcoming every one of you here. We're a place to examine questions of logic and reality and theism and atheism from a multi-axial, as Dr. Jones calls it, approach, not wanting to commit to a conclusion rather than committing to a process. And with me here is Daryl Furlow. Hello, Daryl.
Hello. Nice to be here with you this evening. I won't say a welcome change. That would sound bad, like we're tired of Dr. Jones or something, but, a little change up, something a little different. Maybe we can say something meaningful that might, brighten someone's day. At least that's what I hope.
And then tonight we're going to be, Dr. Jones and Stephen Hoyt are going to be discussing doxastic and non-doxastic theories of truth. I was looking at Wikipedia earlier, looking at theories of truth, and to be honest, I'm amazed I still have hair because my brain was on fire. And I think that maybe this is going to be a very interesting discussion. What say you, sir?
Oh, I'm sure there's no doubt about it. As a matter of fact, we're kind of like the warm-up band, before the big group comes on and wows everybody. Something I was thinking about, though, that there's just so many things that come across on NCG that are, in my estimation, so powerful. And you've already mentioned one of them that we're pretty regular with, and that is the fact that we're committed to a process rather than a conclusion. And one of the recent statements that's come my way that I came from a very wise person. I think it's a very wise statement, and it certainly has a lot of meaning to me. And that is that someone said, "I'm not in love with my viewpoint." And when I heard that, I thought, wow, you know what? I'm not either. I mean, I'd never thought about it that way. But you look at the changes that take place within an individual, such as myself, and sometimes you don't realize, and until it's put to you a certain way, it just doesn't register with you. But when I heard that, I thought, man, that just like you were saying earlier, kind of set my brain on fire. Because, I lived so many years in love with my viewpoint. It didn't matter who I looked at, what I looked at. I had tunnel vision, and I could only see it from one viewpoint. And the thing that has opened up for me is that, what's special about my viewpoint? And my response is nothing in particular.
Right. I mean, one of the things I love about NCG, and I have to thank all of you for this, is that I am learning a great deal. Like you, Daryl, I was pretty much wedded to a particular viewpoint, mine from the atheist perspective. And in talking to you folks and in doing shows with you folks, it's given me an opportunity to look at reasons my viewpoint might not be correct.
Right.
And something I should have thought of a long time ago as a scientist, because we don't try to prove things right. The whole idea of the scientific approach, the laboratory approach, is that we're trying to look for reasons why our ideas don't work. And this here is where I've been able to come to that sort of thing in a philosophical, in a do you want to call it theological perspective? Looking at the text, for example, in a new way, and I'm learning so much.
Yeah, Well, yeah, it certainly goes back to viewpoint. And if you just think about the statement, and really, you know, I think about the years that I lived as a quote unquote believer, and I had a certain viewpoint of scripture. I had a certain doctrine that I adhered to. And in reality, I was stuck there. But for me to actually, I mean, I could say I'm committed to that doctrine. And, I suppose for many years I was committed to a certain viewpoint, a certain way of thinking. But obviously something changed that and my commitment changed. And now I could say I'm committed to a process. But the question is, am I really? And if I am, then I won't be in love with my viewpoint because it's going to be constantly evolving. It's going to be constantly changing because, a person, I'll just use myself as an example, and I don't think I'm the exception here, but that was as stuck as I was to a certain viewpoint. I was, as the scripture says at times, I was immovable. I want to be like God. I change not, and I'm just quoting old passages that I remember. But I'm kind of the opposite of that now. I want to be moved. I want to change as I get better information, as I am able to think and understand more clearly certain things that possibly I just ignored in the past. And it's a different world. It's definitely a good place to live.
Oh, yes. And, don't get me wrong. I still call myself an atheist, mostly as a matter of convenience. But it's really wonderful to be able to look at, let's say, the texts in a manner where, okay, I'm not necessarily going to believe everything that's in them, but I'm getting a perspective on what the authors were thinking, what was going on inside these people's heads as they wrote the words. Give me a view on their world as far as we can do that.
Right, right. And everything, whether it be something that you find in scripture that, let's just say, Paul wrote or John wrote or whoever was involved in the writings, it's no different than anything that you and I might say to one another. It's subject to determining what the meaning is, and of course, that's something that Dr. Jones emphasizes much when he's dealing with the scripture, that, you've got other elements that without them, you can't, in fact, say that you have the proper meaning. It could mean a number of things, and it has to be tested. It has to be, as much as possible. If we truly want to understand the meaning, it has to be scrutinized, and then we're still speculating.
Yes, Dr. Jones has said many times, and I do agree with him that on both sides of the great debate, not all of us, or say too many of us, do not have an understanding of a way to look at the words in the book. And we'll get the wrong idea sometimes, or many times. If you're looking at an English-only rendition, you don't necessarily know what was happening in the original language, be it Hebrew, be it Greek. And by not having that, you're missing a whole heck of a lot. And then, as we're going to be talking about tonight, the various theories of truth. I've known really only a correspondence theory. And there are so many others. What utility do they have? And, how can I use that to further my knowledge? We're going to start learning about that.
Well, I like the statement also that says we don't really possess truth. We have a perspective of truth. And once again, that gives us room to rethink, to reevaluate, to research, whatever we might need to do to come up with better answers and move us forward. And along the way, this has been stated, but let me state it again. It's not that we're against conclusions, that we refuse to come to any conclusions. It's just that even some of the conclusions that we feel like are rock solid, if something comes along that, gives us some different insight, even that may move a little. It may move a lot. But it's like I said, it's a whole different ball game when you can. And I did want to say this also. We can look at scripture passages. We can look at what was written, years and years ago. We can try to figure out what the meaning of it is. But if you think about the advantage that we have, I mean, I'll admit, I'm here in Texas, and you're in Pennsylvania, I think it is.
Yes, I am.
But we're looking at each other, and we're hearing each other's voices. We have a better chance of determining one another's meaning in what we're saying to each other than we do of going back and determining what someone said hundreds of years ago. And so that's where the advantage is. That's where we should really be, taking advantage of what we have right in front of our face, And to me, that's where we miss out so much. We really don't take the time or the effort to understand one another and to draw meaning from one another. And, should I say, God forbid, learn from one another?
And that's my whole thing. I've said it many times. I'll say it again. Should there ever come a day when there is nothing to learn, I think I'll have to cash in my chips. I mean, my life is centered around learning and to learn new perspectives on things I thought I had settled is only a good thing.
Yes. And, it seems to me, I've been involved with NCG for a while now, and it seems to me the ones that are most prone to come our way are those who feel just the way that what you just stated, people that want to move forward, that want to learn, that aren't satisfied just being right where you are, And I really think that most people don't ever really get to experience that to much degree. Everyone learns. And I was thinking about this today, that we're actually involved in process, whether we realize it or want to admit it or not. I mean, there's things that are affecting us day in and day out and changing us, whether we want to or not. But it's so much better when we, number one, realize what's going on. And when we actually willingly, voluntarily participate. And I think until a person actually experiences that, they're missing out.
Yes, and this is why I would really like to see more of my friends and compadres in the atheist community come by, have a look at what we are about, simply because we are not atheist activists. That's no reason for them to necessarily ignore us. We might hopefully, I certainly hope, have some perspectives to offer on how to examine the positions we hold. I have to hold a position from time to time, but remember, that position is mutable. That position is open to change when change is necessary. And on the theist side, I'd like to have more people come by and pay us a visit. We all can learn how to examine things in a better light, in a more open light. And again, as I say, that can only be a good thing.
Yeah, I totally agree. And let me say something. As a theist, I still consider myself a theist, even though I would have to agree with Bob and Dr. Jones that, as far as anything compelling, I can't say to someone else, I can't say to you, oh, you should believe in this God that I believe in. I wouldn't even know where to start. I wouldn't know what to tell you, to be honest with you. And for me, it's just kind of something in the back of my mind that I believe is there. As far as exactly what that means, I see no point in going any further. But there was a time when, and it somewhat surprises me to this day when I look back and see what I believed in, because I look at it now kind of instead of the inside looking out, from the outside looking in. And this God that I believed in, so much of the time I had to come to his defense and then finally when I got honest about it and saw some of the things that he gets credit for, I'm thinking, there's no way, can send a flood and drown babies, that I can't, as a human being, identify with that. I don't, that's unimaginable in my thinking now. But back then, it was like, well, he's God, he's always right. But who said that? Who came up with that in the first place? And I got to ask myself, why did I ever believe that? But, you find yourself in a certain position, and there you go. We're in a process, whether we like it or not. But if that if that process is working against us, we're stuck.
Absolutely. And I guess I'll bring up something I've said often. It's not the God itself that concerns me. It's what people do with that God, how they use that God to affect social policy, for example.
Right.
The world we live in now is not the world of first century Judea. Many things have changed. We've learned many things. And to stay with a perception of that first century mindset is only going to hold us back. Why can't we learn new things and integrate those new things into our existing beliefs?
Well, I was talking to an atheist friend of mine just last night, and he had a conversation with his grandfather, who was very upset with him for being an atheist, and because his grandfather, is a believer, and he's in his late 80s, and he's not going to change his mind, most likely, and his grandson shouldn't expect him to. And the good thing is he doesn't. He was very, he seemed to be very respectful toward his granddad. But at the same time, he was trying to help him to understand, what his position was. But he accused his granddad of cherry picking the Bible, and I told him, I said, well, that's a good thing, and yes, it is. There are some good things that the Scripture has to offer. Some wonderful ideas, concerning love, concerning kindness, concerning compassion, concerning relating to others. But there's where, the difference, I think, is with you. You're willing to consider those ideas and possibly even embrace them. But for someone to come along and say, you have to do this, and the part that I hate the most, I think, is when they say, or you're going to burn forever, things of this nature. That's abusive. That's something someone made up to try to scare others into doing the very thing that they would possibly enjoy the most. I mean, if you have a loving relationship with someone, it's just hard to beat. It's not like you have to be threatened into it. And there's where a lot of the problem comes in. Anything good in the way of relationship, in the way of attributes, moral character, There needs to be no fear there. There needs to be no threat. It's something that once you realize and recognize it, you don't have to be threatened to enjoy it. You just
Yes. And I see that both of Mickey's hands are on the 12, so it's about time to bring Dr. Jones in, and he can introduce the evening's discussion. Dr. Jones.
You know, I so enjoyed, yes, I did. I so enjoyed the chat right here because, you know, both of you are committed to a process, not a conclusion. You know what I'm talking about? Now, tonight we have Stephen Hoyt. He's going to be putting on the table right here on this table, not the Word of God, but he's getting into Doxastic theory and non-Doxastic theory. Yes, you've heard it here. Side 10 Kate will not be in here holding a revival tonight, but Stephen Hoyt will, praise God. And we're going to be talking about possibly a little bit later on theories of truth, but you know, I think this is going to help all of us to get a better dental plan. You know what I'm talking about? It's going to really help us, you know, come together as a people. So tonight, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our special guest, and he is well-read, and, you know, just pick up a drink like mine, and you will be mighty fine. Stephen, hello.
I don't have teeth like that. It's regret, but yeah, great to be here.
You know, I want to be serious about this tonight because if we are to teach, or let me back up a bit, if we are to approach this in a didactic method only, I don't think it's going to work. I think that we need to cover a lot of material, make sure that we're clear. And so tonight I'm going to be asking a few questions, and hopefully we can go through some of this stuff in Doxastic theory and also non-Doxastic theory. And at some point I want to drift into talking about the many theories of truth. And that's going to be fun. And so what say you?
I think it's going to be good. We'll try and limit the scope of the things to talk about because there's just so much to cover. But we had mentioned a few things to talk about earlier this week. So let you set those up and we'll discuss them one by one, I suppose.
Okay, I wanted to start out just with some general information just all over the place, and so it's going to be quite messy at first. But that's the way that it is when people approach a topic or whatever, and so we're not going to get directly into the Doxastic parts of it or aspects of the show first. But I want to talk about Aristotle for a moment. There is a famous quote. This is a translation model, by the way. He says, "To say of what is that it is not, or of what is not that it is false, while to say of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not, is true." What are your thoughts on that? Because that's probably one of the most famous definitions that Aristotle gave to truth.
It reminds me of a passage that Paul wrote about why he does things that he wants to do and doesn't know why, and he can't, and that sort of thing. Gibberish. It's great at the time, but it doesn't. I mean, try and sort that out in a meaningful way between you and me, and it's going to take a while.
He also stated, Aristotle stated, that thoughts are likenesses. I like that. He said likenesses of things. He doesn't really define truth in that way, but some of his usages and many of his rites, W-R-I-T-E-S, seem to indicate that he leans in that direction in a metaphysical sense. And so there's a quote by Thomas Aquinas that I really resonate with. I'm not suggesting that this is where I sit, because none of what I say tonight is going to be my opinion. I want to simply talk about this and that, because I'm going to ask you questions like, what's the difference between a proposition and a sentence? And I think that's important for people to know. When we're looking at Thomas Aquinas, he said truth is the equation of thing and intellect. Do you agree with that?
Between thing and intellect.
Right.
I can see where that would be useful to say. I don't really, not a proponent of any general theory of truth. There are just different ways to talk about states of affairs. And that's kind of how I leave it. But yeah, I can see where that would be a useful idea to have.
Okay, he restated it by stating a judgment is said to be true when it conforms to the external reality. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I think a lot of people have that notion of truth. I don't think that a lot of those are professionals in a field where that actually matters, like science or epistemology. There are very few people that are correspondence theories of truth sorts these days.
Now, when Proclus speaks, he speaks of truth as an agreement or an adjustment, if you will, between knower and the known. Could you drill down on that a bit?
Say it one more time.
Okay, he speaks of truth as the agreement or the adjustment between knower and the known.
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to comment on it. I haven't read his particular works, but I would say that the key task that we're trying to accomplish when we are asserting is to somehow link our statement with states of affairs. And the entire thrust of epistemology is how we're going to accomplish that so that we have some kind of sure foundation that we can work from. But yeah, in general, that's the crux. There's a knower and things to be known. Now, how do they relate to each other?
Now, some philosophers speak in the context of symphony. You know, it's almost like something is in concert. So this is why I'm reading some of this. Others have emphasized that truth is neither in the things or states of affairs themselves, nor in the statement itself, but lies in the agreement between the two.
Yeah, I think that's getting more accurate, or not more accurate. It's getting past a lot of problems that other theories might have.
Okay, in Aquinas's balanced formula equation of thing and intellect, it seems like there's this intention to leave room for the idea that true can be applied not only to thoughts and judgments, but also to things and or persons. Would you somewhat agree with that?
No, me personally, no.
Okay.
Truth for me is about language and meaning.
Now, some people say Aquinas, some people don't, or Aquinas. It doesn't matter. But he explains that a thought is said to be true because it conforms to reality, whereas a thing or a person is said to be true because it conforms to a thought. A friend is a true insofar as, and because she conforms to our or God's conception of what a friend ought to be. Where do you lean there?
Well, again, that would be the key problem is there's a person that may be a friend, but I'm talking about an idea. And the idea, how does that correspond to that person that I have in mind, my friend? So sentences and ideas are about states of affairs and can be about what we think applies to a person. But it's about the idea or the statement that we're making, not about the person so much or the state of affairs that we're trying to address with it. Truth applies to the sentences that we're uttering, the ideas that we're having.
Now, Mendie, and you and I discussed a little bit of this before the show, when it comes to the notion of doxastic theory and versus non-doxastic theory. He starts out in his introduction as stating one of the major challenges facing epistemology is the problem of skepticism, which holds that human beings do not have the capacity or the equipment to know things in a certain manner. Man's senses cannot penetrate into the real nature of things. The senses are deceptive and, as such, are unreliable in decoding information about external object or any other object for that matter. All we have are appearance, and these appearances are themselves mutable, changing, and in flux, unreal, fleeting, unstable, and uncertain. Hence, human judgments are always prone to error. What are your thoughts there?
I don't agree with his premises, but I certainly agree with the conclusions. Our natural senses are the most reliable things that we have, and even if they were fallible and errant, there's nothing that we could do about it anyway. We're still working with what we have to work with, and coming up with ideas to talk about reality. It's still, truth still applies to what we're talking about, what we're saying. The referent of what we're talking about is maybe beyond us in the way that he's saying, and I would agree with that. There's no getting at this raw data that's out there called reality. There's our perceptions of it, our experiences of it, and things like that. Then we make inferences and form different beliefs based on our contact with that reality. But yeah, in general.
Okay, when it comes to doxastic, this is a term used by philosophers a lot. Non-doxastic is as well. Subdoxastic is also a term that is employed in many areas of thought. And so let's talk about the two theories. And before we get into that, typically when people say doxastic, what do they mean by that?
Doxastic, in a general sense, is our attitude about a state of affairs, our dispositions towards states of affairs. Whereas non-doxastic is typically more in a, what do they call it? Base relation, where we're more analytical about things and we rely more on judgments and more externalities. That's just a ballpark off the top of my head.
I've actually heard some people talk about doxastic as if it's, this notion that you have belief upon belief upon belief upon belief, and others would say, no, it's not that simple, but it's a framework, it's a system, if you will. Which would be correct?
Well, there's a big discussion. I think you're hinting at internal versus externalism, where the thing that justifies belief ultimately, in order to avoid a infinite regression, is what they would call it, of having no beliefs that have a foundation. They're all explained by other beliefs. You come up with these ideas, properly basic beliefs or brute facts, or an internalist would say any perception belief that's a perceptive belief would be something that is a basic belief that is justified, but has no other basis for its justification. You can't give an explanation for why it is the way it is. It's a foundational belief, and that gives birth to the foundationalism idea of thinking. So that would be an internalist view of things. The externalist would say, well, that may be true that we take in sense data and we have perceptions and we naturally form beliefs without thinking or introspecting too much about things. However, it's not just up to our brains to come up with the beliefs that we have. There's something external that also has an input, and that external factor is reality itself. And there's different extremes of both, where you'll find some theories that have a little bit of both, where they'll work together. Your beliefs form internally and you can't do anything about it other than expose yourself to be objective, would be the term that they would call it, where you're exposing yourself to things that might change your feelings about a state of affairs or your thoughts about a state of affairs. So in that sense, you wouldn't be completely up to yourself, and you wouldn't completely be left to a determinist view that reality shapes everything that we think versus we shape everything that we think. Somewhere in the middle, I think, is where most people fall. But those would be two general camps, and some of those will have theories that have doxastic methodology, and some that will have non-doxastic methodologies in them too, or ways of thinking.
I want you to picture in your mind's eye Billy Bob Thornton playing Sling Blade, okay? Picture him walking down the road, and they call him Caw. You don't pronounce the R, just Caw, okay? And so I want you to talk to Caw, and I want you to tell him what it means to be an internalist as opposed to an externalist. Be clear to Caw right now.
It's a call.
Call's talking to you. Hey, would this help?
No,
we're talking about call right here.
Yeah, no more teeth. No more teeth. That's just a bad day waiting to happen right there. Yeah, internalist. You can't get at reality. You're not going to be able to see things if you don't have eyes. You're not going to be able to hear things if you don't have ears, or touch, feel. All of your senses are how you come up with things to think about and how to view the world. Now, if you don't have those senses or they're impaired, then obviously your thoughts and beliefs are going to be affected by that. And it can be said, that that's the most important thing. How well are we perceiving, and how is our brain functioning? If there's a correct way for a brain to be functioning, then that will have an impact on, let's say that's the ideal person, the ideal mind at work versus mine, which is not ideal. We're going to have a broad range of things, and that's all based on how we're geared as natural human beings, as creatures that have heuristics that work differently from other people, and to better. Some people are just smarter, and some people aren't. So they'll have different views. But these don't necessarily rely on our contact with reality. So you can say that the most important thing about when we're talking about an internalist view is how well we're doing internally to come up with ideas about reality. And reality may or may not exist, doesn't matter. What matters is what it is that we're perceiving, because that's what we're trying to explain. Is
okay.
In the ballpark?
Yeah. Carl is taking notation. He's sitting to right next to me, okay? This is fun. Okay. Here we go. I want you to be clear about this. In brief, state to me what doxastic theory is as opposed to non-doxastic theory. I want you to be so clear that not only Carl can get it, but everyone on that program can say, need to put some gas and a lot of lawnmower to run.
Well, that's the thing. You got to talk to Carl. Doxastic theory is essentially a theory where I'm trying to go back to the internal states where we're talking about belief formation. So it would be our dispositions, given circumstances and given our states, our mental states. That'd be the quickest way to talk about that.
Okay. And the non-doxastic?
Non-doxastic would be more, let's say, related to a good analogy that people would be familiar with or could easily look up would be propositional attitudes, where we're saying things. A difference between a sentence and a proposition is generally talked about in terms of meaning. So it's our ideas having meaning and conveying something about reality. And and it's our attitudes about those that would be, I think, in that camp.
Okay, let's see if we can head in a direction, let's say, with Doxastic theory, toward foundationalism and all of that, okay? It gets a little bit messy, but you can clean it up for me, okay? And so you're talking to Carl tonight. And I'm going to read a bit simply because I think that some people speak very clear, and I don't to this. I'm long-winded. I'm more of a preacher. Not really. Okay, when it comes to doxastic theories, it is assumed by epistemologists that the justifiability of belief is a function exclusively of what belief one holds of one's doxastic state. And I'm going to ask you to be very, very clear and redundant on what a doxastic state is for Carl, okay? It is very natural because in deciding what to believe, we cannot take account of anything except in so far as we have beliefs about it. This theory has two subcategories, the foundational theories and the coherence theories. And let's not confuse coherence theories with the theory of coherence theory of truth. Those are two separate things.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to think about things. Again, referring back to your mental states, there's a reason why most theories of truth involve belief, much to the chagrin of people that think belief and faith are the same thing. And that is because, again, we naturally form these dispositions to think a certain way, to feel and think a certain way about a state of affairs, and we can't help it. We're always trying to make sense of the world around us, and that's just what we do, and it doesn't really take us thinking about things, actively thinking about things, to come to a belief about a state of affairs. And so for just the doxastic concern, we're talking about what is the basis of belief formation. And typically in that view, you have one belief builds, from one belief comes another and is the basis of another, and so on and so on. And again, going back to the foundationalism, the idea is that there are basic beliefs, to put it in common nomenclature, a belief that doesn't have, that is justified, that doesn't have any explanation or need one, such as I exist. That would be a basis of all beliefs that come forward that you will have. And that was, I think, from Rene Descartes, in his meditations, where he was talking about, I think, therefore I am. He got down to a point, well, here's one thing that I can believe is a foundational belief, and everything else, and he goes on through the rest of his meditations to say, from this belief, I can know this, and from this knowledge, I can know this and this and this and this and so on. So you're kind of building yourself out. An example that I would give that would apply to many theories, if you just shift perspectives, would be like stringing a guitar. And if you have, let's say for a bass guitar, you're stringing the big fat string, the E string, and you know that you have it tuned to E, then you don't have to use a tuner or anything else. You can string the other guitar strings to their proper notes and not have to worry so much about it, because you have the E string, and you can use that as a reference point for all of the beliefs. Now that can lead you into understanding foundationalism. That can also help you understand coherentism. And there's two different flavors of coherentism. I think it applies both for doxastic and for non-doxastic, where you have let's say a web of beliefs in coherent theory, where any new beliefs that are going to be forming are going to be in conformance, or they have to cohere with existing beliefs. So if I have the E string and I'm putting on another string, it's got to conform to the existing string. or belief is the analogy, and so on and so forth. The more strings I add, then the more beliefs are building and forming like a network. Outside of that, another view, it's the same coherence type of theory, but it's not over beliefs in the doxastic sense. It's more about justified epistemic affairs, which would be the non-doxastic. And you have a justified belief, which would be your E string. And from that, you put on the next, E, A, B, G are the strings. And you have a justified belief justifying the next belief, which justifies the next belief. And all of those cohere because they're a natural framework that people are working from. I'm not a foundationalist. Beliefs don't need to form webs based on one. Semiotics is a good linguistic model of how not only languages but ideas can form without having any particular singular basis to work from. But I'm trying to keep it simple without getting technical. But that's the best I could come up with an analogy that might help simplify things. How's that?
Yeah, you're making it quite simple. Thank you. Let me read another paragraph that I think might put something on the table that Carl could actually read. According to the foundational theories, and we have many, by the way, and this is one of the things that I don't want to do tonight. Nothing that we say tonight can be nailed to the wall simply because we're just speaking randomly, okay? And so when we start drilling down a bit on those shows, we will get extremely specific, and we're going to have various people on. But Stephen, he's a go-to and a plus. He's very well respected here. According to the foundational theories, knowledge has foundations and some epistemological basic beliefs. They are, in some sense, self-justifying. It means that they are not supposed to stand in need of justification. But the coherence theories, in other words, in juxtaposition, deny that there is any such epistemologically basic belief. They want to state that the justifiability of a belief is a function of one's total doxastic state, yet beliefs are justified by their relationships to other beliefs. What makes a belief justified is the way it coheres with the rest of one's own belief. Do you agree with that, or is this something that you're not in concert with this particular author here?
No, I think he's done a great job of stating both. I wouldn't try to correct anything there. As far as me agreeing with it, no, there are other theories that make a lot more sense to me than the explanations given for doxastic belief in terms of foundationalism or coherentism. There are things that make sense about them, but there are just too many problems for me that make it not something I try to survive with. There are better theories that do a much better job or much more simple and easy to defend than those.
Okay, let me just read just a little bit more simply because I want to get on down the road in this show and get other people to ask some questions, because it's almost as if, we can throw a book at someone and people can memorize all the terms. And to me, what I hear in the great debate and in most conversations, I hear people using the terms, but I don't think that they understand what philosophers are attempting to do with them. In other words, if this philosopher doesn't agree with that one, it's not like they don't have an understanding of where the other person is coming from. But they are talking in deep structure, if you will, in a manner that most people lose sight of, simply because people are hearing surface structure, and normally people can't handle ideas being thrown around in a context where they have to drill down quite a bit. And this is one of the reasons that I want you on the show, because I know that you are a patient person and you will take the time to do some drilling down so we can have some true juxtaposition even with same terms. Some people would say, well, that's equivocating. Well, when people approach terms, they will say, let's look at coherence. My thoughts on coherence would be different than someone else's thoughts on coherence. And that's what you would hear from, various people. And some people would say, well, the coherence model of truth is one thing, whereas the coherence theory is much different, blah, blah, blah. And it's all over the place, and you understand that. But a lot of people don't, and that's the purpose of these shows, and hopefully we can get to the point. But when it comes to non-doxastic theory or theories, and there are various theories here concerning non-doxastic, these theories insist that some considerations are also relevant in the determination of whether a belief can be justified. Internalism and externalism are the two kinds of approaches of this category. Internalism suggests that the justifiability of a belief should be a function of our internal states. Beliefs are internal states, so doxastic theories are internalist theories. But not all internalist theories are doxastic theories, making a point there. According to the direct realism, that's something else we need to get into, justification is not a function of our beliefs about the perceptual states. Perceptual versus doxastic state. That's something that, Carl needs to hear a little bit about. On the other hand, they suggest that justification must be partly a function of the perceptual states themselves. The justifiability of a belief is determined by a correct cognitive process, and the correctness of an epistemic move is an inherent feature of it. The justifiability of a belief is a function of one's internal states and is not affected by contingent facts. It is also called cognitive essentialism. What are your thoughts on what I just read?
Well, I read that paper actually this week, and it was long. It was very thorough. It was good. Just in the way that's phrased, I would go with the externalist view as being more adequate to what I think that author was getting at. I'm not sure exactly overall where he was going in that particular section, other than to say, in terms of just being a doxastic methodology or ideology, that we're more concerned about, and I'm trying to explain things. I'm not sure exactly if I'm doing a good job of that. So jump in at any time to kind of redirect if you need to. But just the general sense that doxastic is about internal states of affairs, whereas an externalist is concerned more about external states of affairs, if that makes sense. So one of them is concerned with what is going on inside you versus what is going on outside of me and the effect that it has on my internal states. And then what do we make of either case? And again, there's extremes of both. One can just totally not be considerate about reality when they're coming up with their epistemology. It's all about internal states of your mental processes and how you're feeling about different ideas that you're having, versus the extreme over here where we're talking about direct realism. And direct realists will deny that it's about internal states at all. You can't control those. So it's not really anything that's particularly important. What you need to be paying attention to are the things that are actually developing and influencing those belief formations, and the justification is that it's reality that's doing it. That's more like a deterministic way of thinking. But again, those are two extremes, and there's a lot of wide berth between the two.
Okay, Skeptical Jed, he said what many people would say around here. He said, if I used the word doxastic in Alabama, I would be shot on the spot. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, really, you can you can do away with a lot of the philosophical language. It's really categorical so that you can be very particular about different ideas that are hard to nuance without a particular structure of way of referencing those little, the dots over the I's and the crosses for the T's. Yeah, in Alabama, just say, well, what comes to mind? And then is what comes to mind enough to allow you to say something about the world? Right. An internalist will say, yeah, you're justified because you're not inventing anything, and you're asserting what you think is the case. And what better justification is it than you have the idea that formed, and you're an honest person, and you wouldn't be lying, and so it's just, this is what comes to mind about the state of affairs, and you and I can disagree, but I'm asserting what's true because of, well, I'm justified to.
Okay, is this something that's worth thinking about? If we take a doxastic approach or a non-doxastic approach, the reason that this is being used, it's because both are concerning belief, and belief has everything in the world to do with knowledge, correct? That's why epistemology is dealing with doxastic so much and non-doxastic theories, correct?
Yeah, definitely. You come to a state of affairs and you want to know what you can make of the state of affairs, because people have this idea of that it's important to get reality right in their head, because it used to have to do with survival issues. If you miss hearing or interpreting the sound of the savanna grass, you might be eaten by a lion. And then you might not have a good quality of life if you're overly paranoid about every time the wind blows on the savanna. So you kind of want to get reality right, and you got to think about why it is that sometimes you should be concerned about how the wind is blowing across the African savanna versus other times. And that's the task. How do we try and establish ways of talking about the world that everybody can make use of? That's the best way to put it. Yeah, that's epistemology.
Okay, when Seitien Bruggencate was on this stage, to my right a bit, one of the things he kept pushing was, do you know? How do you know? The thing that bothered me was he was not willing to look at all of the different theories of belief, doxastic and non-doxastic. He was not willing to look at justification. He was not willing to look at the many theories of knowledge. He was not willing to look at the many theories of truth, because, he's saying that, knowledge is justified true belief. And that's where I wanted to go with it, because when I started asking him questions relating to the text, that is, in theory, we have two axes in language, and that would be syntagmatic and paradigmatic. And so when I approached it, that is, the text from a linguistic standpoint, he didn't have a clue. And it was obvious in philosophy he didn't have a clue as to what he was talking about. But why do you think that people are trying to use the terms without really understanding in principle how all this works?
I think they understand the terms as they use them and how they understand them in common speak. But when you start talking about knowledge, you're moving into a more rigorous setting. You can say what you want about scientific fields, but and ideas in science, but when you start, talking about methodology and how it is that science has come to talk about things that science has defined, then you better be a scientist, or you better defer to science instead of just layman use of terms. Right. And science gets that all the time. People just misappropriating terms. But there are a lot of people that and we had Anthony last week use a couple of terms over and over again that make sense to use as far as as long as everyone else understands how he's using the terms. Certainty is used by by both gentlemen the same way, as if it matters to something being true. How certain are you that your belief is true? And as far as epistemology goes, either epistemology is only about certainty, or it has nothing to do, it doesn't have one thing to do with certainty. And I'm kind of, well, I'll get to what camp I'm in. So certainty and then reliability is something that everybody else wants when they're talking about truth. And they want to be able to know something so that they can basically tell someone that they're wrong. The whole idea of language developing, and particularly logic, is giving the ability to argue something and to influence somebody's way of thinking to our own, or to our bidding at least. So knowledge as justified true belief, that has some problems because we can be wrong and justified and still say something is true. Our language changes all the time. So when we're talking about correspondence theory, it's hard to say what it is that's corresponding because it's not the sentences, and really because of the meaning of the sentences, propositions themselves change, so they don't necessarily correspond either. All of our, whether it's reliable or all the different ways that we have available to us to justify some idea, that's to instill confidence in us. And we use the word truth as a tag for sentences that do that job. And it's not relating to this sentence corresponds and therefore I believe it, or therefore I can assert it. It's that all of these things make me confident that that I can assert it. It's more about asserting than it is about the practice of saying things about the world.
Right.
It's about justifying yourself to be able to talk about the world. Does that make sense?
Sure, sure. Now, the other night when Anthony was on, I started talking about the multiple theories of truth. We have correspondence theory of truth. We have coherence theory of truth. We have consensus, pragmatic, and so on, even deflationary. You got into a conversation with Ozzy in the thread while that show was playing, and there was a bit of disagreement. Could you explain where he was and where you were in that discussion?
Sure. Last week I had said that really what we should be, and I'll kind of bring in the two of the theories that you just talked about and make this about language. I asked that we should ask what the definition is for truth. And someone said it's that which corresponds to reality. Well, it's not reality that's corresponding to reality. That's redundant, and it doesn't really, it's trivial to say that. So I'm assuming that we're talking about sentences or propositions, if you like that instead. Basically, ideas correspond to reality. Truth is when that link up happens. And so when I was talking to Ozzy, I was asking him the difference between what is it that truth is and what does it do? And it's basically, we agreed that it was different sentences that were being descriptive of the world. And then I was asking about correspondence, and he said, well, sentences can correspond to reality whether or not we know they do or don't, which my natural question is, well, why would it matter to say that they correspond if we can't tell?
Right.
So eventually I was leading into the idea of consensus, and in my particular view, which isn't reductionary, it's simply the deflationary theory of truth, which my camp generally can fall into, which is pragmatism, which means there's nothing to say that the snow is white because the snow is white. We're only making a sentence that has a meaning and it has utility. So we can argue about the different propositions being more or less able to do a job that we want it to. Is it descriptive appropriately? And at that point, you don't have to bring in different or import different ideas about theories of truth. You just start talking about what it is that you mean when you're saying something, and then it'll naturally come with the problems of whether or not it's adequate. What job do you have in mind for the sentence to do, and is it adequately doing it? So deflationary, just to break that down real quick, is that there's nothing to say about a proposition other than it's a descriptive sentence. And to say something is true is just to assert something, anything. You don't have to say the snow is white is true. You just say the snow is white. And that's something about asserting. It's not something about correspondence. And what we're asking is, am I justified to assert something? So again, if we're talking about truth, we're talking about the ability to assert, not about how well our sentences are getting along with nature. Deflationary people that, if you wanted to research to get their opinions on them, a great one would be A.J. Ayer, Richard Rorty, and Van Quine, which he's got the famous one, it's the liar's paradox in his own style, which if this quotation is false if followed by this quotation, something like that. I can't remember. But anyway, so that's kind of.
But I mean, he's getting into a deal atheism in that context.
In what respect? Is there?
It's like saying this sentence is not true, or something along that.
Yeah. Well, he's making a different point than dial atheism, but yeah. I thought you were talking about Ozzy.
No, not Ozzy. I was going with the quote that you were using. No, you and Ozzy were getting into a substantive conversation. I enjoyed it. One of the things that I want to nuance about this show, we are not drilling down. We're simply dealing with some basics. And so, yes, there's going to be a lot of disagreement among people who are well-read and researched in this particular context. And that's why I hope that that we can get into a little bit more substantive approach that is in the context of this discipline at some point. But right now, we want to get everybody on the same page. That's our purpose, and hopefully you'll say, yeah, I'd like to learn some of these terms and, their usage and application, and yeah. That's going to help a lot. You've done a great job here tonight. Thank you, Stephen. I'd like to bring some other people in just to ask questions.
Great.
Okay. Let's open the microphones and bring some. Daryl, what say you?
Well, I don't suppose I have any questions at this point.
Okay. Diana, what say you?
Okay, let me send a link to Jordan. And while we're at it, one question I had coming to my mind when Stephen was mentioning both coherence theory and deflationary theory, and deflationary mentioned that you make a sentence, you make an assertion. But in coherence theory, the web of beliefs that you've got going, in coherence theory, does that web of beliefs have to be internally consistent without looking to the outside? I, who was trained in research, know that, at least in the lab, you want your hypotheses to be coherent with known facts if they are to be taken seriously. And then with the deflationary theory, you're making an assertion, but do you not have to reach out to, say, a correspondence in order to have that theory make sense, or in order to have that sentence make sense?
Yeah, good questions. I'll answer that one first, I suppose. You do not have to have, and really, deflationary theory isn't a theory that many people argue with in philosophy, because a lot of them think it's just trivial. Yeah, it's true. when we assert something, it's just what we assert, and we are saying that it's true by asserting it. So there's no task for the word truth to do. The important part to bring out from there is that it's about justification at that point, which is what you're asking. How does reality itself play into my ability to assert what I think a state of affairs is, or what the best description of that state of affairs should be? That's a general question. And I'll kind of bring that back into your first question, which was about coherence theory and how reality itself plays into that. I think a coherentist would say it doesn't, because we're talking again about reality in the raw versus our interpretation of it. So there may or may not be a reality, we could argue, but for the coherentist, it doesn't matter. If they're an internalist, they've got their perceptive states, and whatever it is they're perceiving, that's what they're accountable to, and that's what's forming their ideas. So it's not that they have to be accountable to reality itself, they're accountable to perceptions. And so their theories about states of affairs mainly are constrained or confined to everything that happens inside a person that would lead them to say something is true. Does that at all make sense to you?
I'm working on it. Little by little, it's getting there. I mean, when you and I were talking earlier about reliability and something else, it took me a while to come to an understanding about that. I think it was justification and verification. That's it. It took me a while to get there with that. So it's probably going to take me a while to get there with this as well. I'm an old lady, the mind is the second thing to go, and I forget what the first is. But I think I'm starting to get an idea of where you're coming from.
Point taken. Yeah, I'm a much better writer, I think, than I am speaker. But having discussions like this certainly helps me work on communicating better. So I'll do my job, and I appreciate your patience with trying to get what I'm throwing down.
Yay, that's a good thing.
Jordan, I see you're on board. How are you?
Hey, I'm not too bad. I'm just mulling over what you guys are saying, and it occurs to me, like, a couple of things come to mind. Is one thing that I've heard about the field of epistemology is that it's so closely related to psychology that psychology definitely has something useful to say about it. And the other thing was this notion that analogy is the core of cognition. And ever since I heard that, and I saw a lecture making that point, it seems so profound to me, and it really clarifies the nature of language, I think, to me. Because of how language is kind of a product of that. Language is analogical in pretty much every usage. So for the terminology that I'm not yet familiar with, and the relationships between them, and that's again, I understood your point earlier you were making, where it's kind of like you have to build up to these terms sometimes, because there are underlying concepts that you have to chunk together, and only then can you make reference to them efficiently. So that's currently where I stand right now. There are some of these concepts that I don't yet have a grasp of, but I think through the process of breaking them down, I can begin to chunk things together and have a better grasp of what we're trying to communicate.
I do a terrible job of memorizing all the different theories. There's just so many of them, and they all have subcategories within those. What I try and remember are what their problems are. so that when someone is exhibiting, like they want to talk about correspondence, and well, a good example would be Dana. You mentioned facts and how facts play a part in our beliefs, and well, a problem with a fact, I would just say, would be that facts are apparent. There's no justifying them, and we can be wrong about facts, and not just that there is a fact and we've interpreted it wrongly. We've interpreted the existence of what we've been calling a fact as incorrect. And so we learned that these would be more about language than anything else. And a good example, and that's the one I always use, I've probably shared this one before, it is a fact that the sky is blue when the sky is blue. It's also a fact that color does not exist. This is not a contradiction. It's about meanings. So when we're talking about facts, we're talking about perceptive states. So this is where we get back into this whole notion of there are beliefs that do not have other beliefs justifying them, but they are justified. And a great example would be what we would call facts. Can we be wrong about these facts? Sure. But there's, it just goes to talk about what we mean when we talk about words like facts. They're not as solid as we once thought. Same thing with truth. When we say something is true, what we're really saying might be different than what we initially thought. It may just be that we want to assert something as if that is the case and there's no doubt about it. And the better job we can do of justifying it, asserting that, makes us feel better and more confident that that is actually the way things are. And I think the biggest problems that people have, at least in the great debate, is thinking in absolute terms of all of these theories, and that there's one that it has no problems, and there's one that everyone should adopt, and if you don't, then you're crazy and you haven't done any diligence and all that kind of stuff. No, there's lots of ideas, and you can't just roadrunner things to death by asking questions and, well, how do you know? Do you know? Well, you just said you could be wrong, and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't get us anywhere. We can talk all day long about here's a sentence and here's why, here are the reasons that justify me being able to assert this. And that's something that when you get into people like Tarek and Sai-Ten, when just the runaround about, well, do you know, how do you know, that kind of thing. Well, you just say, well, I have these justifiable reasons to assert this. I don't have to know. I'm asserting it because of these reasons. Now, what is insufficient about these reasons? Anyway, I get long-winded. I'm sorry.
Well, there's the thing that just struck my mind. When you're talking about something like public policy, you will have reasons for defining public policy, for ways to treat other people, things we should do, things we should not do. Does not one want a correspondence with at least what we know about the real world? And I know I'm getting myself into trouble when I say no. Shut up, Sai. But at least, with that kind of feeds into the facts and perceptions of facts as well. Remember that I'm kind of vested in this. There is a group of people down south who have some very clear ideas about how they should treat me, and I don't necessarily see the validity in what they're saying.
Let me put it this way. There's a reason why I don't particularly care for memorizing every definition of every idea that's ever come across as a theory of truth or of knowledge, and why it is instead that I focus on what each of those, the problems are for each of those. And it's specifically because I want to simplify conversations exactly like the type that you're alluding to, which would be if we can do away with using, let's say during the course of an argument or the course of discussing something that's important. Let's do the consensus thing with an ideal community of people that want to be objective and dialogue with each other to come up with some agreed upon solution. That would be consensus theory. So let's do that now. the important part of that, we can leave out the word truth and we can leave out the word knowledge, but what we can't do is do away with the idea of justification. So if we can do without any of the other words, then when someone says, and this goes for moral statements too, not just about different kinds of non-moral propositions, they're asking the same question: is it justified? So when someone says, well, let's say you can't, what was it, a couple of years ago, you got to go to the right bathroom in a public place. Well,
oh yeah.
Well, okay, you can consider that a moral question or a practical question or all kinds of different things. You would have to state what the goal is. And this would be where Richard Rorty would come in and say everything that truth deals with or propositions deal with isn't about correspondence or so much about reality as it is about obtaining a goal or achieving a goal that we had in mind as a community of ideal beings. Again, referring back to a consensus theory. So what is the goal of the argument that you're engaged in? If we can simplify any of your conversations about God or about morality or social justice or things like that down to what justifies, what is the goal and what justifies your current beliefs, then it's easier to have those kinds of conversations because what you assert will be in line with the goal that you have. And it's easy to discover based on what people's actions are, what their goals really are. So if they say that, well, it's a practical concern that a specific gender has to go to a specifically gender identified restroom. Well, what is the goal of that? If it's to say that, about child predation or something like that, ridiculous. Well, does that actually have any impact on it? So we can say objectively, based on different reasons, whether or not we'll obtain that goal. Does that make sense? The same thing with the moral sphere. If we're going to say that being bald is an immoral state for me to be in, you have to ask why that is. And then what justifies the belief that it is. That makes sense?
Yeah, that's making some degree of sense. And then the other question that comes up, in reference to me and my sisters and my brothers, you also have to ask what gender is. And a certain group of people have an idea of what that is, and it comes from an interpretation of a certain book. And then there is a community of researchers who are coming to a different idea about that, with a set of experimental results that they believe makes the point they're trying to make. Where do those two come together, or how is it that they don't?
Yeah, something that might be helpful. I try and simplify as much as I can when it comes to subjects, especially argumentative ones, so that they're easy to contain. So I don't care whether or not I think something is immoral. Again, we get fixated with terms. Is being transgender or homosexual or heterosexual, are any of these moral ways to be? Who cares? That doesn't, whether or not you label something as moral or immoral does not matter for any real purpose. What matters is what happens. What does it mean when we say something is moral? There are implications with that, meaning there are negative behaviors and consequences that go with something that you would say are immoral. And we can talk about those consequences of certain behaviors without having any use of the term moral. So then we can have an objective conversation about, take homosexuality just for example. If our concerns in society are harm, or reciprocity, or any of the general principles that we categorize as moral, and just ask which ones of those does it violate, we probably won't come up with any. And then if the only objection to homosexuality is about what somebody wrote in a book a long time ago and really isn't there in that scripture in the form that that modern people are taking it, why does it matter? Why does there, if I'm making a moral statement that isn't doesn't have any implications of harm or any doesn't violate any principles that we would call moral, then it's really not a moral question. So all that to say, you can simplify a lot of things by saying what is starting with what is the goal, what are the implications of the goal, and then if we're going to assert something, do we achieve the goal, and are we in the direction, and we're going in the direction that the goal is asking us to go. Man, that's a lot of talking. Sorry. Does any of that make sense? Jordan, you're kind of
Yeah.
a little bit there.
Yeah. As far as addressing the underlying goal, I've definitely found value in identifying that and clarifying that in the process of resolving a disagreement. And especially when it comes to goal-oriented pursuits like moral evaluation, because morality is based on a goal, just kind of by its very nature. I guess I think of goals as being subjective, or they relate to a subject at least. Because morality is about trying to attain a certain state of affairs, it also has to deal with the way things are right now, the state of affairs as they are, and then finding a way to change the state of affairs. So that's why I think that's what I see as where the confusion comes from, morality as this, entity being subjective or objective. Well, it's not really all one or the other. It's that relationship between the subject and the object. It's the relationship between the way things are and how we want them to be, given the goal. And so that's something I try to clarify now when I have disagreements with someone on a moral issue, is clarifying the goals and the state of affairs as much as possible, and finding common ground. And I guess does that relate to the consensus you were mentioning earlier, consensus model of truth, I guess?
Yeah, there's no, it doesn't relate, but I'll kind of reiterate just in a couple words again. There's in the fear in epistemology, or kind of the litmus test, is whether or not what you're saying is relative or whether it's objective. And what people mean by objective or relative is objective would be, it's not just up to me and what I think, whether or not something's true. There are things that are just true. And just the same way that there are things that are moral and there are things that are not based on just my say-so. However, the standard in epistemology is the ideal or the perfectly rational person. Someone that is able to shed bias, wants to know things as they are, as close as they possibly can, and exhaust themselves looking for truth or morality, whatever the goal is. In a consensus model, you have a community of those same types of people. Now, whether or not they exist, or that community exists, or the individual idealized person exists, isn't the point. What is that we are, and I think it was Habermas that was one to champion the view that it's impossible to have such an ideal person. It's impossible to have such a egalitarian, open group of people coming together to find the truth or find morality. but it's that everyone is in general pursuing, wanting to be that individual that's objective and wanting to know things in and of themselves and wanting to be a moral person. That's where it matters. And when we form a community, let's say a scientific community, it has its own consensus and it agrees on its own methods and what's going to count as justification and what isn't, which again is why science has backed off in some sense on correspondence theory, because they realize how much methodology plays in calling something true. It's not that we just suggest that something corresponds to reality. It's more that there are these internal theories of how we're going to conduct business as a particular kind of community, and what outcomes we're going to get for all that effort. So that, consensus would philosophy is a consensus group. Anytime there's a peer review, that's exactly involvement in consensus type of arrangements. So anyway, no, to answer your question, it didn't relate, but yeah, it's very important though.
That is amazing. As soon as you mentioned peer review and consensus theory, I think I got a piece of it.
Hey, there you go.
Yeah, I hadn't been thinking about that. Don't ask me why, because I've been subjected to peer review more than once. But yes, that makes entirely good sense. And then the other thing I'm going to have to look into, that you were talking about the methodology, about science backing away from correspondence theory a little bit. I'm going to have to look at that. I am sorry that I got pulled aside for a minute there, but my phone started ringing and I wondered who it might be, and it turned out to be a family member I haven't seen in over 10 years, and I'm glad I picked up the phone. So I'm going to listen to what I missed later on and fill in the blanks, but thank you. Thank you for that bit about peer review.
Sure. And if you're curious, the science is moving more into a pragmatic view, as far as my understanding of the contemporary science. It started back with the grand design, I think it was, with Landau and Hawking, talking about model-dependent theory. And this is so old, they announced to the world in this book that philosophy is dead. Well, it was a couple hundred years before that. People are talking about, well, no, it's more about you can have, here's what disproves or discounts correspondence theory. It's the fact that you can have two competing models over the same state of affairs, and each one of them is just practically identical. So it doesn't matter whether or not you call one true and one false, or which one it is that you call true. They all have a job to do, and it's to model what we think is going on, and it's based on utility. It's a totally pragmatic view. It's also the technical term is a Marxist view, a socialist view of truth. Habermas, of course, was one of those. And I've talked about him a couple of times. But anyway, yeah. So that's when you start getting into consensus theory. It's a social engagement that we're involved in. And this is why I was saying last week, or hinting at last week, that when we think about truth, we need to think about obligations, that it's a social conversation that involves obligations to ourselves and to others. So this is why, even though I might have a warranted basic belief that there's a God, if I'm asked for justification for why I believe there's a God, I should be able to give some account for it, even if it's just to say, well, it's just a basic belief that I have, and I can't, it just would be unethical for me to, for no reason at all, not believe it anymore, even if I could choose to not believe it. So yeah, I'd have to answer, I would have to account for this warranted belief that I have that I can't otherwise justify. Anyway, because it's a social engagement. When you ask, I should answer, and that's ethical.
Okay, thank you. And then there is, of course, the question of how close you keep that social engagement. You know, do you go outside looking for things that will invalidate what you believe to be true? And I hope that some people anyway would embrace that, because I mean, I was trained to think, yeah, you don't try to prove anything, you try to disprove what you think is correct.
Yeah, that's very Popperian of you. But you're a scientist, so Popper ought to be somebody that.
Yes, you could call me a pauperist. Yeah.
Well, I'm poor. I'm just a pauper.
I think something that came to mind when you were mentioning, like, the fact that it's okay that we can't attain this perfectly rational person or whatever. You know, it's kind of just an idea that we're working with. It reminds me of like asymptotes in geometry or mathematics, and how even though it's, you know, a particular curve is not going to hit that asymptote, it's still useful to talk about it. And this whole time I've been also thinking about geometry and like Cartesian coordinates in respect to the fact that we're able to express truths with different frameworks. So polar coordinates versus rectangular coordinates. You can express the same curves, the same points in a system using both polar coordinates and rectangular coordinates, and they're both going to be just as true, but they're different ways of expressing the same thing, and they can be useful for different things as well.
Yeah, and sometimes polar coordinate is a more easily comprehended view than Cartesian. Sometimes Cartesian is better than polar. Yeah.
Right. And I've even thought of morality almost in terms of geometry. It's kind of a funny thing. In terms of in geometry, we've got these concepts of transformation, right? Where you can I don't have the exact terms with me, but
Are you speaking of rotation, translation, that sort of thing?
yeah. And so it's like you're starting with a particular state of affairs, but then there's a certain way you want to shift it, right? You want to change it somehow and make it some other way. You can talk about what it would take to get from what you have to what you want, and you know, or even, you know, what's the shortest distance from point A to point B, and so that you can represent a goal-oriented pursuit in that way, I guess, mentally. And when it comes to morality, you can kind of imagine visually how when you're trying to get from one state to the other, there may be obstacles in your way or limits on how you get there. And so, but one of the assumptions, I guess, ought implies able, for example. You assume that it's possible to get from point A to point B if you ought to get to point B. And there, say, for example, you're trying to draw a curve from point A to point B, but there's some obstacle keeping you from drawing a straight line to it. You have to go around the obstacle in some way, and there may be a whole series of obstacles, you know, a maze between A and B that you have to explore it or investigate how to get there, and you can even establish kind of a hierarchy of criteria for evaluating the best way to get there, and the criteria can depend upon whatever relevant how do I say that? Whatever relevant ends you're trying to meet, right? To to make it a little less abstract, I guess, I start to think of like if you're trying to go on a road trip, but you have a particular destination in mind, but there's multiple ways of getting there. You can have criteria where you want to take the most scenic route. You take one way. You want to take the route that's the shortest distance. You can take it another way. The one that will get you there in the least amount of time, which can differ from the shortest distance. That can be another pathway as well. And so the criteria can be arranged in a hierarchy depending on what's most important to you, and make an evaluation based on those. And so the word best, the best route to take, can be evaluated as long as you were able to lay those criteria out. So it's not completely subjective. You can come up with an objective evaluation as long as you can name what the criteria are and what order they're in.
Yep. Remember the asymptote. Somebody once said that in a TV show. But yeah, the point with a perfectly rational person is that it's just the idea that if I give someone the reasons that helped me believe the way that I do, if I'm being objective, then those reasons ought to be convincing to that ideal person. And for the most part, to anybody that's just like me, that's as ideal as we can get or hope to be. But yeah, but I totally agree with your view of morality. I've argued that a lot, that the objectives that we set out to obtain morally can be completely subjective. They can be completely random. However, just by defining what the goals are, we know objectively what courses of actions in general will take us closer to obtaining that goal or farther away from achieving the goal. So yeah, that's a perfectly good way. There's no reason why I should prefer the fastest route to the most scenic route. But once I pick one of those courses, I can certainly objectively say I am getting there faster than any other way, or this is certainly the best view. It's the most beautiful experience I've had going to point B before.
And of course, what qualifies as the most beautiful has criteria in its own.
Right, exactly. Well, that's the wonderful thing about being a human being.
Yeah.
When you were talking about the getting from point A to point B with obstacles, it's one of my favorite things is machine learning and artificial intelligence. So what you're talking about is discrete versus stochastic environments where you exactly have to I think maybe what you're talking about was a weighted path, a way of objectively evaluating the best way around an object or some kind of obstacle or whatever.
Pathfinding is kind of a word that came to mind.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, most of my theories of knowledge and truth and how people think has been from trying to figure out how to develop artificial intelligence and how machines would learn. And it comes down to the two most, well, it's hard to say something's the most predominant or whatever. A highly utilized methodology and framework, put it that way, is genetic theory, coupled with neural networks, where you have different nodes responsible for different tasks and things like that. And
Right.
and all of it works on heuristics. So when we as human beings think that we're machines, it's kind of it's an oxymoron, because machines, we're trying to make machines that think like us so that we can think like machines, or at least our theories, we want them to be concrete, and we want to be able to know capital T truth in some kind of way we can reach out and grab it and experience and all that kind of stuff. And we're trying to make machines that are like us, but the machines that we are making all operate on heuristics. They're all mental tricks. Emotions are a mental trick to shortcut a hell of a lot of processing that would have to go on to evaluate current states of affairs and what they should mean to us. Not just, and meaning itself is a way to shortcut. Do I do action A or do I do action B? So these are all heuristics that play into being a human, and it turns out those are great ways to actually make artificial intelligence. But once we get over the idea that we are machines and the truth is something concrete, we aren't heuristic about perceiving the world, that we actually, there's something that we can reach out and touch. Once we get over that, we'll be a lot better off in terms of understanding ourselves and what we are doing by saying something is justified or is true or matters, if that makes sense at all. So anyway,
Yeah.
the big thumbs up for artificial intelligence and
and don't forget there's a big difference. Okay, I'm getting a little bit of a there it's much better now. Don't forget there's a big difference between the carbon-based machines and the silicon-based machines. There's big difference in computing power. We still haven't got to the point where a silicon-based machine like the one I've got over on my desk there has anywhere near the power in one case that you or I do in this case up here. And there's several trillion computers working in parallel up here. So at some point we may come upon a way of getting the parallel processing going to allow for the emergent properties that we exhibit.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in artificial intelligence and artificial consciousness for all those same reasons, especially because they have the capacity to transcend some of the limits that we have. And at least in specific applications, those limits have already been transcended. And I think kind of like the relationship between the binary computing that we normally use and like quantum computing, they're different ways of doing computation, and they each have their advantages and disadvantages and optimal uses. And in the same way, the type of memory that computers use differs from how we remember things. We have associative memory, and they have kind of a memory in terms of bits, discrete memory, and each of those have advantages and disadvantages as well. And we just have to evaluate what's the best strategy for our particular application, I guess.
Yeah, and there's a spectrum going in the carbon-based machines. I remember maybe about 40 years ago reading an article that was meant to be a joke about a new system of computer logic that consisted of yes, no, and who knows. But it turns out that these brains up here work on pretty much that system. It's amazing.
Yeah, we're a lot more simple than what we hoped for. So that's when people start coming up with all kinds of aspirations of, well, we can get at the truth. I'm like, yeah, I don't have that same aspiration, but good luck to you. So anyway.
Yeah, but that probably got off track a little bit. Let's get back on the rails here.
Yeah. Well, heuristics applying to theories of truth, meaning that we're never going to have a theory without problems, and we can only look at the utility that they serve. And usually those are matters of, they concern themselves about language more than anything else, more than applying to reality or whatever. It's how are we going to agree to talk about reality? And does it make sense? Is it useful to talk about reality this way versus that way? And when I assert A instead of B, does it make sense to versus not? And can we understand the reasons why even A has problems and we're still going to go with it anyway? That kind of thing. So I think if we approach religion that way, the existence of God, since this is, kind of a show about the great debate, I think we can all get over ourselves if we stop taking absolutes, taking the other side for fools, first of all, and then thinking that there's this non-heuristic way to get at the answer to that question. That for me, there's a million reasons why we'll never know, but atheists are warranted and theists are warranted to believe whatever it is that they believe about the existence of God. Maybe not necessarily what they are going to say about God, but just the question of God's existence. That's something that that's just a perceptual outcome. We're either going to think the idea of God makes sense because of our experiences and our perceptions of reality, or the idea of God is not going to make sense. And you can't pretend to be in one camp or the other. You can't choose to be in one camp or the other. The best that you could do is, if you had the perception that there is a God, you might just table it as, well, that's just a perception that I have, and it's just an artifact that some people feel that way, and I'm just going to take it as a feeling that I have, and it's not very important because I can't make anything out of it. And there are great psychological reasons for me to deny that there's something more to this feeling that there's a God than just that there's a feeling that there's a God, if that makes sense. But if, like me, you have a feeling there's a God and nothing else is particularly compelling in arguments against the existence of what I'm thinking or calling a God, then I'm powerless really to reject that it's false. Just that I think it's true and it's warranted because it's a compelling perception that I have. What I make of God, I don't really give a lot of merit to, other than how does it make me behave, and is that desirable behavior? So I wish more theists would consider that, because there's a lot of behavior in that camp that isn't desirable, even by the accounts of that entire group themselves. So anyway,
were you here, or I guess last time I was on, did you hear me talk about my notebook?
I may have missed it.
Okay. It's a notebook that I was given at a Bible study or something like that at my church way back in 2011, and that was a couple years before I identified as an atheist. And in that book, I wrote down some thoughts I had about God, and I still have it now, and I read it and it's like, I don't remember what it was like to have this perspective, but my perspective definitely changed from this, because what I said in here was, I am reasonably certain that he exists. He makes the universe complete. He gives it all purpose. Reality makes sense with him. That's what I thought at the time. I thought it made sense for there to be a God. And 2 years later from that, I no longer thought that. And yeah, so that's just something that reminds me of how it's possible to change my mind, and I want to be open to that, because I think I've made improvements since then.
In what way? Just let me just get personal with you. In what way have things gotten better for you?
Oh shoot, what? I guess what specifically could I say about that? I admit, like, the transition was pretty rough, and it had some negative consequences socially, but there was I think there was always a cognitive dissonance within me about God, and up to that point, and dropping that belief, I guess you could say, consciously, and that seemed to bring a kind of resolution to me, and it made me feel like I was being more consistent, more honest, and it was like I was no longer struggling with certain things that did not make sense, even though as I stated here, like, at the time, it made sense that there was a God. In spite of that, there were other things that that didn't make sense when I believed that. And
Did
now,
sorry,
oh, go
did
ahead.
you experience like when you knew that you no longer believed that kind of stuff? For me, I experienced a sense of complete freedom, which is very liberating. Was that a common experience that we share, you and I?
Yeah, I would describe it that way, sure. Yeah, and in fact, let's see. Yeah, what I did when I first started writing in this, that wasn't even the first statement I made. The first statement I made in it was, "I do not love God," and I said, "His love does not move me." And so, in that sense, it felt like it was my fault that I felt distant from God. And of course, when I identified as an atheist, it was like looking back, it was like, no, it wasn't my fault that it felt like a distant relationship. It was an absent father kind of thing. He just wasn't there in the first place. And the silence was coming from his end, not mine. And so that, yeah, that's kind of what that freedom feeling came from. And of course, I've since entertained new ideas of, new understandings of what God is, what God's nature is in the first place. And at some point, by the way, I think it'd be interesting to have a discussion about the metaphysical God that you described to me last time, because I'd like to know a little more about that. But yeah, I've come a long way. I've gone through a lot of changes since then, and I'm glad with where I am now.
That's a perfect place to be, I think. Mm-hmm. Even though you're not going to be there tomorrow, you know.
I hope not.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, Dr. Jones, you've been standing aside quite a while. Do you want to weigh in on anything?
Here's where I am. I'm thankful, and I've gotten a lot of feedback. I've been reading text messages on my phone, and people enjoyed the way that we started out tonight with Diana and Daryl talking.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
People are very, very pro you. I mean, you are amazing. Daryl is amazing, and I can't brag about you two enough. And then when we went into the chat, that is when I started talking with Stephen, it was the conversation that we could have without being interrupted. You know, sometimes when you're in a conversation and you want to pause without someone else jumping in. I remember when I was talking with Eric Coven and he was on stage, and I love Greg Bray to death, but if you could have seen Eric Coven on stage, he was at a loss for words because he couldn't understand how a person like me with so much love could be in the position that I'm in today. And it was hard for him to deal with, and it was a beautiful moment. And if you'll go back and watch it, you know, Greg Bray jumps in, "Oh, I've got a question. I'd like for you to be on my show." And it just interrupted the magic, if you will, that was happening. It was a wonderful time, to say the least. But Greg, he didn't know, and you know, he's young, and sometimes we just interrupt or whatever. There was a time in which I was saying things to Cy 10 Bruggencate, and I could tell, because I was close to him, I could tell that he was uncomfortable, and if there was ever a time that he would have changed, it would have been possibly on the show. But we had too many zealots on that night, people who would rather speak than listen. And that's the paradigm shift or the reset or the pivot that I want to make. I want meaningful conversation. I really don't give a damn about whether you're right about everything. I'm not looking for the most polished philosophers. I'm not looking for the most polished theologians. I'm looking for people who are a little bit more authentic, if that makes any sense. I'm looking for people who are willing to say, this is the way that I look at stuff, and no one else may be able to understand it but me. I would rather have those people on the place than the people who can make, let's say, the arguments that people make. And sometimes the arguments are simply made and they seem impressive simply because we haven't thought about them long enough. And by the time that we ponder them, they don't sound so sophisticated. And this is why I do not applaud, people without intellectual charity. I think intellectual charity is a necessity in conversations. And this is why I really am a fan of my special guest and friend tonight, Stephen Hoyt, because he brings an element of just himself here. He's well-read. He has opinions that differ, and that's what I like. I enjoy the diversity. I enjoy the pluralistic approaches, and so that's where I'm at. And so it's good. I wanted to say something else because we have an in-studio band, by the way, and yes, they are practicing music, and the band will get larger and larger and larger as we go along. But I would love to have our shows to where we have a little bit of music, a little bit of just new people like you, Diana, taking control of the show and just saying whatever you want to say. And then I can get in. I don't have to play the major role. I would rather support people. I'm all about trying to build a modality that supports humanity than I am about the individual. And one of the things that I wanted to ask Stephen Hoyt tonight was, we have these individual beliefs, and then we have group beliefs, and we never discuss that. And so atheists get together, and they have this group belief, if you will, and individuals have personal beliefs. And so, I would like people on who would discuss a little bit of this and that. And this is why I really enjoy listening to Steve, and I enjoy the hell out of listening to Ozzy and others, because I find myself, growing up a bit, and I'm an old man. And sometimes I can do funny things like with teeth. One of the things that my grandchildren love is I have a pair of glasses. And some of you guys don't know this, but I leave the glue on the side here, and I keep putting more glue because I chase them around the house saying, I'm going to put these boogers on you. And every time that I see my grandchildren, they're looking at that and they're saying, those aren't boogers, Grandpa. And it's just funny. So there's the funny side of me, and then I like getting serious, and I do enjoy building community, meaningful community. And I've got some exciting news to tell all of you. Wow, we have some wonderful people coming to the studio, and I can't wait until I can say who it is. But with that said, thanks a lot, Diana. Thanks a lot, Jordan, for being on the show. Thanks a lot, Daryl, for being on the show. And Stephen, thanks a lot. What are your final comments, and then we're out of here?
Well, final comments. I always enjoy coming on the show. You have created a great environment for the kind of community that we were talking about, an ideal community where there's equality among the guests. People have time to express their own ideas freely and openly. So, this might be an instance of where that ideal community exists, and we're trying to get at the truth. And it turns out that might just be a process that's important rather than the whatever else obtains from it.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. Now, you were in martial arts. My grandson has become, I think it's called a junior black belt or something like that. He's just about to that point. He's impressive, but I think I can still take him. I tell you what, he's a lot of fun. He's a lot of fun. We have some major league guests coming our way, but one thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to make sure that I connect them with all of us who are so unpopular, and I'm one of the guys. I'm the unknown. I'm the guy at the bottom. I hope that I always am there, because there's something about being at the bottom that you get to see things that other people don't get to see. And one of the things that I want in this community is a lot of heart. That is my wife and I and people here at NCG Studios, we spend a lot of time providing food to people who don't have anything to eat. We're talking about people who live in homes where they don't have electricity, they don't have water. And yes, we're talking about people who actually come to my house bringing 5-gallon buckets just to get a bucket of water so they can flush the toilets. Because they're not embarrassed to come to me. They're embarrassed to go to other people, but they're not embarrassed to come to me because we show a great deal of love and respect that is for humanity. I'm not bragging about me. I'm just saying it's about time that we let our hair down a bit and learn how to nurture. That's something that I've learned a lot from my wife, Rhonda. I mean, she's an amazing person. She knows how to nurture people. And I'm not sure that we're doing that great of a job on this show. I hope that we can, because we can all learn philosophy inside and out, but if we don't learn how to nurture one another and provide for each other in that sense, I think we all lose. With that said, good evening, and send me your thoughts on what kind of songs the in-house NCG band needs to play, okay? Good night. We love you very much.
Good night, everyone. Take